Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Frankenstein from 1931. Frankenstein is probably considered the best Universal Monsters movie. It is often on, if not the number one, it's the number two, and is directed by probably the greatest director of the Universal Monsters series, that being James Whale. This being his first actual horror film. He was brought over by Universal after doing like two kind of war movies in Britain, and they kind of let him do whatever he wanted, and boy am I glad they did. Frankenstein's kind of an interesting film, and especially with James Whale and all his horror films, because they have a lot of stuff in them that can represent all sorts of things that can be read into, that can put other meanings on, and that's certainly something that's in older Hollywood films because of production codes and things like that. James Whale does it with such a majesty, you almost want to sort of figure it out. You almost want to decipher those meanings and sort of try to sort of figure out what exactly it is saying. In some ways it's being a very classy adaptation. There's actually a version of a play written by Peggy Webling of Frankenstein. It was adapted from that play, which I assume was successful, and which is of course adapted from the Mary Shelley book. It very much feels like a very classy studio director kind of film. Bride of Frankenstein is a lot of fun and a lot more silly and a lot more easy and obvious to read into. The first Frankenstein, I don't see that. I mean, it's a very good movie. It's an amazing movie, but when you're reading into it, you're reading into certain things that it says that I think come off as more of a universal or broad or whatever kind of reading of it. A lot of that has to do with how this story tackles everything from Dr. Frankenstein's not wanting to actually get married to keep experimenting, which is a very obvious thing to read into. Like, he's delaying his wedding. He's holding all these people up so he can do this experiment. This movie gets kind of like goes off into a different plot line where his dad's like, well, he's not going to come to the wedding. Forget, like, bringing people back from the dead. What's happening with this wedding thing? I don't know. And you're just like sitting there like, I don't really care about this wedding. Can we go back to the monster? Like who cares? That wedding looks like it might have been like a little fun, but it mostly looked like it sucked. I would much rather see the monster. It looked like a wedding that you get like sort of sick of. You're like, can we leave early? Oh, it's the whole town and we can't. Wow, this sucks. And there's obvious things to read into that where it's like you don't want to grow up, how marriage and growing up kind of stifles that creativity, or how that creativity, which was the monster basically, like it was his idea to make this person and everything, and it comes back to haunt him. That creativity, you can stifle it through quote unquote maturing or whatever, but it's always going to come back, and you can't, in his case, you can't trap that down. The idea of maturity doesn't mean you can just suddenly stop being creative or stop being artistic or stop experimenting or doing new ideas. And in a way, it like almost kills his wife, so you can definitely read into that. One, I think the basic interpretation is that, and as someone personally who, when I was growing up, I never sort of knew my own strength, so like there would be times I would do like amazing in a fight, and there are other times I do like really bad. Or I'd go to grab for something and I'd like use too much strength. I was never very good at that. And so as a kid, particularly the scene with Maria was horrifying. Well, I mean, it is horrifying. That is a horrifying scene, but it represents so much of what you often feel of when you get bigger and possibly stronger, and not knowing how to control that, and that fear of that, and that panic of like, I didn't know, that wasn't what that isn't, I'm sorry, like that's not what I meant to do. And like I was a kid, and like even if I'd rough house with someone, maybe something, I would move in some way that would like really be way too hard, but I just didn't know. And I think with Frankenstein, that scene in Maria, it's horrifying, and also it's horrifying because you don't really see, like you do but you don't. Like, she goes in the water. That water didn't look too deep, but I often imagine that he did something more, that we don't know the logistics. And I never want to know, but it makes it horrifying that he didn't know what he was doing. He thought she would float, but maybe he broke her back. Maybe he hurt her before. Maybe the way he threw her in did something to her. And I don't think he really knew what he was doing, and then he just panics and runs and is scared. Sometimes when I watch this film and the whole idea of Frankenstein as a character, you could get into the nature versus nurture thing, that he just doesn't come back as an instant like killer, but it's also that he's too young to really know any of that. Clearly, like, none of the past lives or past info of what that brain was up to really has infected him. So when he's trying to figure things out, and like, I don't know how many days he's alive before the villagers come after him, but it couldn't be that many. The idea that they're like trying to make this person accountable for these things when he doesn't know how to speak and barely knows how to do anything, it's horrifying that that person is stuck in that situation. The monster isn't really even given a chance. I think a lot of that is because of Karloff's performance, which is amazing. At the beginning of the film, it's just question mark, they don't tell you who it is. At the end, they say it's Boris Karloff. But Boris Karloff brings such a sense of humanity to someone who doesn't really know what their humanity is. I've often talked about how I think physicality in actors is such an interesting, amazing, and powerful thing if done right. And Karloff, we're just coming off of, this is 31, so this is a very early sound era film. We're just coming out of the silent era. He was using that kind of training, and Karloff was an amazing actor, but using that kind of silent film presence in there while everyone else is talking and doing the sound film thing, and playing off of that, but also understanding like the walk of the monster, the presence of the monster, not even understanding what they're doing with their hands of the monster kind of thing. If you've seen a baby, sometimes a baby will just like hit itself by accident because they don't know. And like Frankenstein doesn't do something like that. But in theory, that's sort of what he's doing. He's like kind of reacting to a lot of things. He's showing the pain and the confusion. And Karloff, this has often been called one of the greatest physical performances of all time in this film and Bride of Frankenstein. And Karloff's just such an amazing actor, and it's really what made him Karloff. After famously Lugosi turned it down or was fired or whatever, who cares? Karloff was amazing in this. He basically reinvented that character. You can't think of Frankenstein, even though he's the monster, but if you see him, you go, oh, that's Frankenstein. Let's like be real. I will call him the monster through most of this, but when you think of the idea of Frankenstein, when you think of that name, you think of Boris Karloff, and you will forever think of Boris Karloff. The stitches and the flat top, that is what Boris Karloff brought to this role. He brought an image, he brought a darkness, a gothicness to it. He's always wearing black. Like, it almost feels like he's kind of lurching over in some cases. He feels very scary, but he feels like someone who's like, I don't know what I am. I didn't want to be this. And some of that is the darkness of humanity and being born and not understanding what you're exactly supposed to do in kind of more of a monster form, which I think Karloff understood how to do that. There's a lot of sophistication in a performance that doesn't really say anything. One of the things I really think is interesting, this invented also the kind of scary mad scientist castle imagery. In that set, like, the film like drastically changes, although the film doesn't just stay in there, it cuts away. But when they're in that castle set, that invented that iconography. It was probably around a little before, but when people are referencing it, they are referencing this movie. I like that James Whale makes it look scary and creepy, but also the idea that everyone has a shadow that's latching on to the walls behind them, that you can tell there's a lot of space and light and scariness in that castle. It's a set, but it feels almost like it's a location. The way they shot it, the way they lit it, gives it that kind of spookiness. And this film sets itself up to be, it does the thing at the beginning that almost William Castle would do, where it like warns you that Mr. Carl Laemmle's worried that this would be too scary, which was used in the first two Treehouse of Horror Simpsons episodes and has been referenced all over the place. But it almost like makes it feel like, oh, I'm watching something like kind of controversial, even though it's like, this is the highest grossing film of 1931. It was a huge hit. Everybody saw it, but it gives it that element. That element, it's like buying a CD with a parental advisory sticker. Hearing something's banned like makes it a little more tantalizing. I can't imagine what it was like in the 1930s seeing this, because you probably would have been like, ooh, this is like the producer wanted to warn us. The intros of the James Whale Frankensteins always have like a bit of showmanship to them, a bit of theatricality, a bit of camp, a lot of fun. And I think that intro just so exemplifies all of it. It's just so good. I love that intro. Frankenstein, I think, is a classic monster because of this movie, and I've often seen like all-time great film lists picking this over any other Universal monster film. I don't know if I agree necessarily, and watching it this time, I will say I think I might be more of a Bride of Frankenstein person and less of a Frankenstein person in recent years, but I still have always loved this film. It almost feels like it goes by too quick. Like, it's so referenced and it's so part of culture, it almost feels like where people say, oh, well, everyone knows that by sort of osmosis or something. And Frankenstein feels like that. Even the first time I saw it, I felt like I had already seen it. It's not this film's fault that it was like such a big momentous deal that you kind of can't escape it, but there is something about that I often find like it goes by too quickly. It's only like 71 minutes. It's very short. It's just so kind of perfect in what it's doing. I can't think of a more perfect Frankenstein film. There's been other actors who've done it, but in some ways it's like, who cares? Because Boris Karloff did it with James Whale. What they were able to kind of say within it. I can look at it and see all sorts of different things. You know, the fear of the villagers once Maria's dead, like they almost become the real monster. You know, how that shifts in such a dramatic fashion. And how the monster almost doesn't feel like the monster. He feels like someone who's been put in this situation by everyone. How Frankenstein, the doctor, doesn't feel that good sometimes. Like, I don't know, this film is morally very complex, because I don't know if there's like, maybe his wife is the good guy. I don't think there's like, for a horror film, there's not like a final girl or you know, something that like really represents something to the audience. Like, we're going through it with this person. It sort of becomes the monster. You kind of want to follow the monster. You want him to succeed. You want him to get out, but like no one ever gives him a chance, and he never gets to really learn. Like, as soon they kind of fail in learning, because they're like, I don't know, what if we like just show him fire? That'll probably work. They never give him a chance. They never give him the chance to be something and evolve into something. It's just like, he was always evil and he always will be, and he's condemned even though he didn't really get to do anything, and the evil he did do was more of a misunderstanding than anything, and he's shown like superhuman type of strength and all of that. This is kind of an essential horror text, an essential film text. You're not going to go wrong with it. It's very short. These films are great for like, if you want to get kids into horror films. These are the only horror films I could see as a kid. Like, I couldn't see the slasher stuff. I couldn't see the George Romero's. I couldn't see any of that, but I knew the Universal monsters really well. So I've seen Frankenstein like a lot of times, and so that might be why like I almost feel like it's like breathing or something, this movie. But it falls into that very well. In fact, I find myself having a difficult time separating it from that. Whereas like Bride of Frankenstein, I don't think I saw till I was older, and like loved the camp of it and the ridiculousness of it. They were taking this very seriously and really trying to do a great adaptation. So I don't want to say this is necessarily as fun, but it is like, it just feels, the energy of it feels so great and so classic. In some ways can't deny it, but you also are kind of stuck in this thing where it's so legendary, you almost feel like when he says it's alive, who hasn't heard that, when you know, go through all these things, but still wrapped up in the complexities of it. I was still wrapped up in what all these things mean, how it could mean things about, you know, trying to hide yourself, as James Whale was a gay man, how, you know, them kind of trying to hide away maybe their sexuality, like hoping, you know, stop doing that, it's time to get married, you know, you can't be gay anymore, you have to be this archetypal kind of role now, you can't do what you're doing before, that's not regular society. And it's like, kind of like, doesn't matter if what he's doing is his passion or who he really is. It's interesting in that, the sense of normality, the sense of society dictating normality, and not really wanting to sit down and understanding the kind of complexities of what was really going on. It's almost like all of them understood that that's how kind of the evilness of society, while also being able to talk about kind of like this horrific thing that, you know, he's messing with God, you know, he feels like he is a god. And this was considered very blasphemous and controversial at the time. This was the kind of creepiest horror movie at the time. I love Frankenstein for all these things. You know, I wish maybe it hadn't been referenced to death, but it is still an all-time great. And I still really love watching it, even though it feels like I've just seen it since I was so little, that it like sort of is like, it's like just a thing at this point. But I still would recommend it. I still think it's great for like, if you're carving pumpkins with the family, you can sit back and watch Frankenstein. This is the sort of beginning of modern horror, and this film represents so many different things. And I was thinking, you know, I could have just like rewatched it and probably found more things within it, like what that represents, what, you know, maybe, you know, Frankenstein sort of represents the plague and how, you know, he went off without his daughter and then he came back and she was dead. Or Frankenstein represents, you know, maybe a rapist, or represents so many evil things, or represents, you know, people who probably were going through the woods at the time and would just kill off whomever. And it represents that darkness of society, but maybe that darkness didn't know. Maybe that darkness, not the rapists, but those people are horrible, but maybe that darkness, you know, was confused. Maybe that darkness didn't entirely know what they were doing. Maybe that accident we should kind of read more into. It makes you think about all the more complexities of it, even though the solutions are often dealt with in non-complex ways. Frankenstein is kind of the great thing I love about kind of classic Hollywood films, is that I'm thinking about deeper ideas after I watched it, and it didn't come out and tell me that. Those are just things I'm reading into it. And while also being a very classy, good, entertaining, fine movie, I think is a really awesome thing. I think this is the kind of thing I love about classic Hollywood movies in general. And Frankenstein, James Whale, is able to say that so immaculately that it really makes you see why the Universal monsters have lived on to this day and are able to represent as much as they are. So, if you would like to talk about Frankenstein from 1931, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.